My name is Filip Sablik. I'm the president of publishing and marketing here at Boom Studios. Boom Studios is the publisher of Lantern City under our Archaea imprint. We're really proud to be partnered with these fine folks to produce this steampunk epic. So, without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists. So, I'm going to start with the co-creator of Lantern City, Mr. Trevor Crafts.
Everybody.
And next we're going to have the co-writer of Lantern City, Ms. Mairghread Scott. And the other co-writer and co-creator of Lantern City, Mr. Matt Daley. Take the backpack off, stay a while, Matt. Hang out. And then last, but certainly not least, certainly not requiring any introduction, but I will do it anyway, co-creator and actor Bruce Boxleitner.
All right. Thanks for coming, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. So the topic of today's panel is obviously we'll get to Lantern City, which you guys are all intimately involved in, and has a really audacious and ambitious world-building component to it. But first, we wanted to present a panel and a conversation that was more about the idea of world building and the work that goes into it and the considerations you have to have in it. So,
yeah, I mean, world building is, and I think a lot of people hear the word transmedia and world building, and they're all sort of, I think to a certain degree, interchangeable. I think that right now we're in such an interesting time in media where you have the ability to really extend out, the world that you create. We've got a couple of examples that we wanted to sort of go through. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, and I think that, just sort of seeing how other creators build world will sort of, certainly informed us as to how we wanted to build out Lantern City, but also, just sort of helps to define, just how far you can take a world in this, sort of media environment of ours. So I think the first one up we have is Walking Dead. I don't think anybody's seen that show, but if you have, it's a good show.
So I'll talk a little bit about The Walking Dead, not to bore anyone, because I'm sure everyone knows a lot about The Walking Dead already. But from a world-building perspective, it's interesting because obviously it started out as a comic book. No one anticipated when it was first published that it would become the juggernaut that it is today. No one expected when the television show first aired that it would become the juggernaut that it is. I mean, it is the number one rated show.
Can I tell a little side story?
Absolutely.
No.
So,
Filip knew.
Funny story I'm going to name drop because we're on a panel.
Yeah.
Should be able to do that, right? So, in a former life, I worked at Diamond Comic Distributors, which is the biggest distributor of comics in the world, and pretty much all comic shops nationwide. And I was a purchasing brand manager there. And one of my first accounts that I built a relationship with was with a company called Funkatron, which was the self-publishing outfit of a guy named Robert Kirkman, who went on to create Walking Dead. And the funny story about Walking Dead is that Robert had gotten his foot in the door at Image and doing some work, kind of a work for hire deal for another creator's book, and they let him pitch a couple books. And his first one was a superhero book, because if you're trying to launch a new book in comics, it's like kind of a safe bet.
Invincible.
And then he did the zombie book, and it didn't sell very well. The first 6 issues actually sold pretty poorly and did the typical thing where launched here and then kind of was petering out. And so around like issue 5 or 6, Jim Valentino, who was the publisher at the time, was kind of like, I don't know what this book is, and like what's unique about the zombie book, and the sales are kind of dropping off. It's not going to work. And he's on the phone with Robert, and Robert, on the spur of the moment, said, Jim, what you don't understand is that this is all build up for an alien invasion. And we're going to get to it in issue 12. And I've been seeding it all through the series. And when we get to issue 12, the aliens are going to invade, and it's going to be a zombie alien story, and it's going to be crazy and bananas, and you've never seen anything like it. And Jim went, oh, that sounds pretty good. That sounds interesting. Okay. And of course, there was no alien invasion. He never planned any alien invasion. He just figured if he could get to issue 12, he was either going to be working or he was going to be broke. And so about, sure enough, issue 7, which was the issue after the first trade came out, the numbers started to go up, started to build and build. And then around issue 10 or 11, he gets another call from Jim Valentino, or maybe Eric Stevenson at the time, and it's like, Robert, the series is really good and it's doing pretty well, but like I don't see any, like, when are you gonna build up to this alien invasion? It was like, heck man, there's no invasion.
Well, he did say in an interview I heard a few years back on the Nerdist that he knows exactly how it's going to end and when it's going to end. I think he wants to do like 500 issues. It would be great if the last panel was just
Alien invasion.
a ship coming out.
Told you.
Yeah.
Told you.
But I think the interesting thing about The Walking Dead is because it had such limited exposure when it was first released. I mean, I could be wrong because Kirkman's obviously a super smart and talented guy, but I don't think he expected it to be what it has become. And so it has, I don't think the intentions in the beginning were to have this huge world building thing. Also because one of the most important things about world building is, people want to immerse themselves in the world. And I think there's a little bit of, I don't want to say, not wishful, a little bit of what would I do if with zombie movies, which I think people, they always like that. Well, if I was in that, I definitely wouldn't get in the car because I know we're going to run out of gas or whatever. And there's a lot of that with The Walking Dead. And there's people always dying and stuff. So how far you want to take it, you could almost be limited. But with Walking Dead, they have a great, I think it's great, series of games through Telltale. Has anyone played those? Yeah, and those are really good because it's all based around choices. Like you make this choice and you have your consequences, which is, I think, perfect for video games where it doesn't quite work so much in television or in comic books, because you have more control as the creator, as the participant as well. But what's nice about The Walking Dead now is it's expanding. You're finding more things. There's RPG games, there's board games, there are now spin-off series too, there's novels. So it's sort of a little bit based on fan needs and desires, but also it's like, how much do you want to really spend in that world, only because it's such a downtrodden, dark place. Too much time probably will, jar your whole life experiences. But so that's The Walking Dead. But I think it's how it's sort of organically happening is a really good example of world building. The next one,
Maybe not such a good world.
Well, no, see, I disagree, because I think the interesting thing about Walking Dead is, because I started reading The Walking Dead around like issue 70, and I went through the omnibuses. And you get through like the third omnibus, and you're like, I wish sweet merciful death to all of you. Like, I'm done, I'm so sorry, because they're not, the comics are written to be read in a monthly manner. And so the comics are much more down than the TV show.
Right.
But you see the TV show has to move a lot faster, they condense a lot of that, it's much more uplifting, because they both have the idea of the central theme of The Walking Dead and of most zombie films, which is zombies are essentially, they exist to purify intention. And so they make us our best selves and our worst selves. And everything about The Walking Dead is when you go with your basest instinct, your animal instinct, or your tribal instinct, my way or the highway, or when you go for your higher instinct, what is actually worth preserving in society. And it's just about, the thing about world building you have to understand is that every time you move to a new medium, you have to establish that pace differently. And so I think it's really interesting to read The Walking Dead in issue format, where I think it really excels, versus in like the all collected omnibus, where it really does start to feel grinding, versus the TV format, where it again is a more organic pace for how that is consumed, versus if you were binging the TV show. And like that, as a writer, is really interesting, because you have to consider the pace at which you expect your audience to consume your media.
And I also think with The Walking Dead, and also a bit with the Game of Thrones, is that I think outside of really Daryl on The Walking Dead, I don't hear a lot of people talking about how much they love the characters, and not that they're badly developed characters, it's you're with people on a very long journey in their worst conditions, at their lowest points, essentially, over and over and over again. It's like, oh my God. And with Game of Thrones, it's a lot of time, these people are all vying for the same thing, and they'll do anything to get, even an ounce of power. It's like, these people aren't really likable, and we're accustomed to, at least, from a writer's perspective or an audience perspective, like, we're supposed to have characters that we can relate to or that we want to be, and a lot of times, I've never heard anyone like, I want to really be like Jamie Lannister. I'm like, really? Or like, boy, Rick's a great guy. Like, that's a guy I would take on a camping trip with me anytime.
I'd totally be Carol.
Yeah.
I believe that.
But it's such a mind-blowing thing to me that these are the biggest hits on TV for the last few years.
Yeah.
Everyone, they're like the water cooler shows. So, but anyway, we can switch over to The Matrix, which before I go into The Matrix, I'll say that I love The Matrix movies, even though I know 2 and 3 aren't that great, but I love The Matrix movies. I saw the first one in the theaters 5 times. To give my credibility.
You're gonna admit that.
I love The Matrix.
Matt,
I liked it too.
Matt, I was in the same theaters. I was with you.
So I saw it for the first 3 times. I saw it with other people, and then the second, 4th, and 5th time I saw it by myself. Whatever, who cares? But the interesting thing about The Matrix is that when the first film came out, it was just a film. And then before Reloaded came out, they added these other world-building components. One being the Animatrix, which was a series of animated shorts, and then Enter the Matrix, which was a PS2 and Xbox game. But where they tripped up a little bit, even if you enjoy the game or the Animatrix, is that they almost made it a requirement for you to absorb these things prior to going into Reloaded in the theaters. And if you didn't, which I didn't before, I did it after, you felt like, why did I just watch? Like, I'm so confused.
Yeah.
Did I like this? I don't know. There was 500 Agent Smiths, and there was a cool car chase, but what was going on? I don't know. And then once you sort of read with the press, like, well, you should really see the Animatrix before you see Reloaded, and you really benefit from Enter the Matrix before seeing, so you get the full story. And that sort of limits because, a theater, a film-going audience isn't necessarily the same as an anime-watching audience, as is the same as a video game-playing audience. And I know there's so much, crossing between those, but they can all be seen as very different things. And I think they tripped themselves up a little bit by making it almost a requirement to really understand and fully appreciate it. The one thing I'll say about The Matrix that I think is kind of fun about its afterlife is that it's very big in academia. There's a lot of books about religion in The Matrix and philosophy in The Matrix. And if you have time, or you're a little obsessed like I am, you should get the Blu-rays, because in the Blu-rays they have commentary tracks by philosophers for all 3 films, and they have commentary tracks by critics who hated the movies. And I think it's kind of a bold thing that the Wachowski siblings allowed that to happen. It's like, people basically hate these movies, and well-regarded critics, and we're gonna let them tell why they hate the movie, and then we're gonna have someone else come in and explain why, it's a philosophically rich world.
But for us, I think that's one of the sort of, if there are rules on world building, I think one of the rules is don't make things required as you continue to expand your world. Because you will, like you just talked about, there are those elements where, everybody's not going to ingest all of the content that you're putting out on whatever media platform that it is. So make all of your content additive and not required, so that if you're really excited about something, you can sort of spur off and check it out and sort of explore an area. And
I was fully agree, because I think the interesting thing where The Matrix sort of inherently had a weakness was in the sense of, because almost all of the characters we meet are programs, essentially there's the assumption that all of those characters have consistent information between them. So they are all aware perfectly of what is happening and what their history actually is. And that becomes a real natural reaction, because you want your world to be unified, but really most worlds are incredibly dissonant. We don't have, no one really, in the South, the Civil War is called the War of Northern Aggression by some people. Like, no one agrees on anything about history, about religion, about anything that's important in the real world. And I think one of the things that The Matrix trips up on is that by having so much agreement or expected agreement among its characters, like such a unified theory, once you drop information in one place, it becomes redundant and uninspiring to drop it again, because it has to be exactly the same information. Whereas like in Lantern City and in other world building, one of the biggest advantages is have 2 or 3 different narratives of how people are operating their lives. If there was a war, there should be people on both sides who think that their side was right, regardless of whether or not they lost or won. If there's a prophecy, there should be tons of disagreement over who is or isn't the chosen one.
And that, when we talk about, transmedia or properties that exist in multiple mediums, whether it is The Walking Dead or The Matrix or some of these other things we're going to talk about, that is like one of the big underlying questions, right? Which is, how do you make tell different stories where nothing is required, but they all matter.
Right. Yes.
And uncertainty is a big way to do that. If people can argue that in their story, their thing is the most important because of their belief system, your world becomes exponentially more fulfilling from a number of different angles.
Yeah.
Power Rangers. I guess I can talk a little bit about this.
Can you?
I hope so. So Boom is actually publishing Mighty Morphin Power Rangers right now. It's one of our best-selling titles. But we thought it was also another interesting and good example of world building. Not only because it has stood the test of time, it's over 23 years old, it's universally and you know, internationally and across many age spectrums recognized and has survived. Essentially, every single season is a new iteration that takes the same mythology and reinvents it with a new set of characters and a new set of problems, but kind of the same core concepts. And I think what makes this one particularly even more interesting is that Chaim Saban, who arguably created Power Rangers as we know it, took it from a pre-existing Japanese property and essentially remixed something to create something wholly new. I think this is a good example of something where, because the core mythology and the kind of, you know, the base rules of this property are so solid, you can reinvent it to the point where in the comic book that we're doing right now, we're looking at the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers characters that first debuted in the early 90s and reinventing them in a way that is modern without being cute and aimed at an older audience than the original show was originally aimed at. But they're all still recognizable, and the world is recognizable.
And do you know if that's what the plan is also for the film? I think it's to aim at a little bit of an older demographic.
I am under the pain of death to say anything about the film other than, wow, isn't that a great cast shot?
That's a good cast shot.
Those kids look good.
Pre-release. One of the other things about Power Rangers, and I think, you know, again, since we're talking about world building, and I don't think everybody always considers this world building, but I think that having products that kids or adults or anybody can sort of get behind is in its own way a kind of world building. So having the Power Ranger action figures, you know, you're really unleashing the imagination of kids all over the world to invent their own Power Ranger stories. And you know, that's one thing that certainly with Transformers, I think that's obviously started as a toy line and had a huge animated series, you know, and you've done a lot of work obviously on the comics. So, you know, how did the products and the toys inform that world building?
Oh, yeah, well, I wrote on Power Rangers, and on just the issue 1, but there's an interesting thing with Power Rangers and Transformers because I've written on, I think, 4 different iterations of Transformers, something like that. I don't know. Someone that's a Transformers fan will let me know.
You've got a tweet already.
Exactly, yes. Mairghread Scott did not write on Power.
It was actually 3.5.
Yeah, exactly. The interesting thing is, a brand like that, the important thing to remember is that you start to get into more of a sports team mentality, which I know sounds weird, but essentially it's like people who like the Red Sox, they like the Red Sox as a brand, but whatever, like there is a year or there's like a couple of years that are their Red Sox, you know?
Right.
And you get a thing with brands that have a lot of longevity where you have to build in spots where the next generation can feel both the continuity, the continuation of the brand, so like the Power Rangers looks and a lot of their abilities will stay consistent, but that generation has to feel like they're not just playing with their dad's toys or their older brother's toys, like they want to feel like this is their version of the brand. And so it's important to be able to, if you're building a brand, to spread not so much outward across a lot of different media platforms, but forward to have a really long time span, you need to be able to hit on what are the core themes of this brand and what are all the different ways those themes can be expressed. So like every version of Transformers has Optimus and Bumblebee and Megatron, although Beast Wars didn't have Bumblebee, but Cheetor is basically Bumblebee.
We all know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
And
know
the
what that
concept
Transformers
of-
thing is. That wasn't Transformers. I don't know what
Exactly.
that-
And the theme was always essentially often boiled down to how does this generation relate to war? And so you had a bunch of iteration, whereas each generation sort of had a different approach, and their parents had a different approach of like, what does sort of war mean to them? You would see the brand swing to like lighter and darker, wildly at points. To accommodate that. So you'll see a lot of Transformers fans and a lot of Power Rangers fans, like they will specify like, I am a G1 Transformers fan, or I'm a Beast Wars Transformers fan, or this, the most important thing about Power Rangers is, the one where they were police officers. Like, so.
Well, and I think that, obviously with Transformers, you've got, and we did this also with Lantern City, you have this huge, long history with Transformers, all the way back to Cybertron, all the way back and forth, and each series sort of picks up at a different time frame in a different period. And I think also what's interesting is that Transformers is primarily driven by cartoons and media, and I think Bruce with B5, there was a lot of world building in B5, but it was not so much because it was also in a different time. There weren't as many video games and toys and other platforms, but there was obviously this long television arc and then the films as well.
Yes.
Good.
I agree
Moving
with all
ever
of the
up.
above. Yeah. Different beast in a way.
Yeah. Different times.
As to what you're all talking about now. By the way, Tron was Matrix before Matrix was, okay?
And when Matrix and Tron is interesting too, because obviously, Disney tried to expand in a transmedia way that franchise with Uprising, which was a great. If everybody has not seen Tron Uprising, you definitely should, because it is a truly excellent show.
It really was.
It really was really good. But that's really taking that world and building it out.
Then you want to talk about world building.
Yeah.
They really expanded on that with the animated, different medium. Babylon 5, though, we created a world. We created a lot of worlds, all the different planets. But it all took place in one world, like our Lantern City.
Right.
I don't think in our Lantern City we visit many other places.
No.
It's always within this walled city. So it, I think it was before its time. I notice everything now, and I'm just everything's a continuing saga now.
Right.
From your Game of
Phase
Thrones.
the first.
And no one wanted that then, and that's why they kept saying, well, go ahead and do your little space opera, but I don't know how we sell this thing, because we can't do episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 like that. Can't we just put them on? That type of thing.
Right.
And that now everything is a continuing saga, which I love. I mean, I'm not complaining. If you'll notice that, there's very few shows anymore that are one-offs each episode, and it's a brand new episode. There are still, but
Yeah. They're mostly
I think it's the predominant thing.
I think that kind of storytelling is I think really what's capturing audiences, all over the world for all of these properties.
Oh yeah.
And I think for one set of walls to another set of walls, you guys are also working on this.
Yeah, we're also publishing Maze Runner comic books, and obviously that started off as a hit YA novel series that was then adapted into a film series, which hasn't concluded yet. And then we came in and expanded the world, specifically the movies, the characters that were introduced in the movies, even further, and built that out with the relationship that we have with Fox. So what's interesting about YA properties, I think in general, is they tend to be very strong in world building, because I think as teenagers or as preteens, a lot of what we're looking for as people that are consuming entertainment is we want to project ourselves into the story, because we're trying to figure out what our personality is. So whether you're looking at Maze Runner or Hunger Games, or before that Twilight, like these are all things where in many ways it's more about the world than about the characters. It's about exploring themes and concepts and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I mean, the next one we have is probably the granddaddy of all the world building, which is Star Wars. And I think the interesting thing about, especially Force Awakens, and how Marvel has really looked at world building in our modern era of media is that, you know, I think they're doing it the best of anybody across the board, without any kind of equivocation. You know, from the Force Awakens, if you want to find out why this, you know, Star Destroyer is sitting in the desert, you can play Battlefront. If you want to find out why C-3PO has a red arm, you can read the comic book. If you want to find out more about all of these different things, you don't have to. You can watch the movie and you can enjoy it and think it's great, but if you really love the world and you really want to explore all of the little avenues and all the little areas that you can, that's, I think, where the comic books really come in to play. And I think that's really showing, and certainly something that we've feel very strongly about, that comic books are really a wonderful medium to create a much larger world and expand out your world. You can write stories and you can expand your world that way, but you know, certainly in comic books, we always joke, you know, comics have an unlimited special effects budget and you can do pretty much whatever you want, but it's really a great place to explore you know, all of these side stories, all of these different stories that as a creator, I think, you know, we're always dying to tell those kinds of extra stories. And then they extend out into games and all the rest of the huge Disney machine. But
well, that's not just something that started with TFA. I actually think one of the greatest examples of world building is the fact that the Clone Wars are a throwaway line in the first film. Like the first film is a standalone film, and Obi-Wan Kenobi has he has a line where it's like, I met your father in the Clone Wars. Like, and then he just moves on. We never really find out what the hell that is, or, you know, and then that later becomes an entire TV show and 3 other movies that we learn about.
Well, and that first movie is so great about introducing a bunch of characters that all seem to have a backstory,
Right.
but we don't know them. It's like, you know, Han walking into, when you walk into the cantina, and there are all those characters that the main characters interact with, and you're like, who's that guy? Who's that bounty hunter? Like, what? Like, why does he look like he has a story?
Well, and that's the interesting thing, because I think the greatest lesson that Star Wars ever did was that Star Wars, especially the first movie and the first trilogy, drops a lot of little details that are personal that don't get explained a lot, which is really great. Like, there's always the pressure from, especially if you're in TV and their executives, is you have to explain everything, and you really don't. Like, very little of the world is explained to you, especially for children. Like, children know about like 60% of what any adult is saying at any time, and they just roll with it. So like, I very much encourage dropping seemingly useless details like all over your world building. I think the one weakness, just because I want to be shot, I think the weakness of Star Wars, which you don't see as much because of the TFA reboot, is that they mined every character that you ever saw on screen, and it took a long time for Star Wars, because I love the novels, but it took a while for you to start getting brand new characters that had brand new stories. So there became this joke that like my husband and I had, that like, no one's just an asshole who wants credits. Like everyone, like there's literally like, there's the scene where Han runs to like the Millennium Falcon, and I remember hearing that like, you know, that third stormtrooper has a novel about him and how he was really conflicted about this, you know, and it's like, really, that guy, he's really conflicted? Yeah, oh yeah, he's secretly working with the rebellion, and it was all like, everyone had like this elaborate backstory, you know, and like, so and that's great, I mean, it totally worked, but I'm definitely, I think that sometimes worlds can start to cannibalize themselves when you don't essentially allow yourself to have minor characters or characters that just pass through, you know, and I don't know that, like, Avatar, if anyone watched, like, the original Avatar TV show, and there's the cabbage vendor guy, and he just shows up and he does this cabbage skit where his car gets blown up, but you never, like, find, like, the life saga of the cabbage vendor guy, you know? Yeah.
I know I'm for
Unmined potential.
Yeah.
Exactly, but I think that there is an important element of world building, which is leaving some things unmined. Once everyone becomes important, it's very easy for your brand to essentially become incestuous, where it's like, Luke Skywalker knows everyone, you know?
Well,
Like,
everyone knows Luke too, at least that's what The Force Awakens.
Yeah, that's what they said.
Well, I think it'll be interesting with these spin-off films, because the first one, which I believe is released in December of this year, is essentially like a throwaway line
Yeah.
for the first film too.
Yeah.
Oh, we got the blueprints for the Death Star, like, let's make a 2-hour film about that now, you know? And I think there's a hunger for it, but eventually it will, I would imagine, dissipate a little.
But I think, you know, but obviously what Lucas did was he built this huge, big, gigantic, enormous, huge world. And it's endless, and it goes on forever. And there's so many elements of history that they can pull in their own mythology that basically, we will die. Everybody in this room will die, and there will still be Star Wars movies that happen after we're gone. Without
yourself.
Some sooner than others.
That's not.
Well, I think it's the one thing about Star. Well, I think
You meant this like take the brand out with it. Like,
No,
this
he does have a plan.
I have a plan. No, I think the one interesting thing about Star Wars, and I'll say another series that does a poor job at this too, is it can be sometimes a little confusing about the time, like the history of it. No series is worse, and I love these movies. The Rocky series. If you try to actually follow the timeline of the Rocky series, it makes no sense at all. It's kind of fun though, because like in Rocky 4, his son is like 8, and then when he gets back in Rocky 5, his son is like 25. Like, what happened? That was a long plane ride back from Russia.
The novels have a very consistent timeline. I'm just going to say.
Well, if I could ask, before we get into the stuff, because Mairghread, you seem to always find yourself, whether this is by choice or not, but working in worlds already. So you're always sort of world building. There's like Transformers or the animation stuff that you write, and Lantern City. But also you're a little shout out to Mairghread. It's awesome. You make that series called Toil and Trouble, which trade is out.
Well, all the issues are out now, and then the trade will be out this fall. So.
But in that too, I think you probably have to walk a fine line. Like how much do I incorporate from the Shakespeare play Macbeth? Are people coming to this knowing the story? I mean, how does that play into world building too when you're playing in someone else's sandbox?
Well, the assumption always has to be you really have to start out every time you write a story that no one knows anything about your brand. And you have to decide what's important for people to know and what is just like a nice sort of nod you can give. So you want to essentially give a bunch of little details to feed, like if you've watched 35 years of this show, like you'll recognize that dude in the background, but you don't want it to ever feel like your audience can't catch up or can't get into the brand. I always say when I'm writing on Transformers that as long as you know that these are robots and that they become a vehicle of some kind, like that's all I need you to know to start with a story that I've written. That's all I'm trying to expect you to know. I know, right?
Except in
yes.
Beast Wars, which is why it doesn't count.
Although, surprising number of them just become household appliances as well. Just you turns into a microscope, I'm not kidding. It's great.
Can I tell a very funny Transformers story? I've told this to Trevor in his story.
I'm just waiting for Bruce to jump in and go, no.
Yeah.
Transformers.
So my wife and I took her uncle on a double bill when the first Transformers came out in summer of 2007. So we took Transformers and then Ratatouille right afterwards. We hopped. And afterwards he goes, I don't know what's more unbelievable, cars that turn into robots or rats cooking food.
That's a perfect segue.
Two
That's a
lanterns.
perfect segue. I couldn't write something better myself. So.
Lantern City, I guess just as we'll do a very quick summation of Lantern City. So Lantern City is currently a comic book series, and before that it was a novel. So the comic book series, the 12th issue is coming out in just a couple weeks.
Yep.
And we'll wrap up the current comic series. And so it's a big epic storyline, but it is a steampunk saga.
Yes.
Unlike I think anybody's attempted to do in fiction. And
Also true.
Yeah.
Also true.
So.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, Lantern City is about, it's essentially the story of this walled mega metropolis, which has 3 different stratas of society. So it's got the Grey Empire, they're sort of the ruling class, the workers, who really are almost sort of a slave labor sort of level, supporting all of the machinery and buildings and agriculture to basically support the Grey Empire. And then there's this sort of growing, literal underground community, which is sort of a city beneath the city. And there are no rules, there's nothing you're not living under the sort of thumb of the Grey Empire, but you could starve to death. Violence is very common. And so, sort of all about choices and what you can do and what kind of life you want to lead. It's very hard to travel between these different social strata. So in building this, we originally had conceived it as a television series, which we're still working on developing currently. And Bruce and Matt and I sort of had come up with the original concept, and then Matt really built out this sort of core ideas that Bruce and I had into this really big, expansive universe. And essentially we started this with Rise. And Rise is the illustrated novel, sort of a prequel novel to Lantern City. And it takes place about 150, 200 years before the comic book series. And it's all about Isaac Foster Gray, who was essentially the first leader of Lantern City. And I think the interesting thing about when you start back that far is that you're sort of backwards world building in a way that maybe Lucas didn't do very well with some of the original sort of original series, was that you sort of have to plan out where every decision that you make is going to lead you. And every decision has to have a plan, and you have to sort of know where all of this is going to take you, whether you're 10 years in the future, whether you're 100 years in the future, or 500 years. That's sort of your timeline, and you have to be able to bend and sort of move things around all throughout it. So if you click on the next one. Some of the fun about doing that, though, is you get to sort of explore the origins of things. So in the comic book series, we feature very heavily the Lantern City Guard. Our main character, Sander, he becomes a member of the Lantern City Guard. And in Rise, we're able to explore sort of the origins of the costume and the armor and how we sort of build everything out. Some of the, even young Killian Gray, we're able to sort of put it all through. His lens in the beginning is sort of the bookend. So, and I think one of the things that's interesting, you sort of do all that development and you build all of that out, and then you find another medium. This was an illustrated novel, and then we obviously linked up with Archaea and Boom, and we created the comic book series. So, and Matt, why don't you talk a little bit about how, just that world building a little bit, and then we'll pass it to Mairghread as she sort of came in to help fill all that out.
Yeah, I think that in world building, in choosing a medium for every story, you need to justify why you want to tell a particular story in a particular medium. And so I started this Sanders story as a book, and it just wasn't working. There's something about it that there is obviously like an inner struggle within the main character, but just it did not feel like it wasn't working as a novel. And it was just around the same time we were fortunate enough to pitch to Boom, and we originally sort of went with the concept for the TV show, and then we're like, well, what other ideas do you have? And I just haven't worked on this. And I think what works about this storyline and why it works for the comic book is because you.
Thank you. They're big fans in the next room over.
Is we needed a character that would sort of travel throughout the strata of the society, which was always planned from the book as well. And so, could I tell this story in about 12 issues? Yes, a complete story in 12 issues. Yes. Would it introduce readers and fans to this world in a way in which they would maybe not completely understand every part of the world, but have a good grasp on it? Yes. And so that's why it really, I think, works well as a comic book. And it also allowed for our amazing artist, Carlos Magno, and our great colorist, Chris Blythe, to really shine and show some amazing stuff that they're capable of.
Stuff like that.
Yeah. Mairghread and I are not the artist. People are always disappointed. I find. Oh yeah, like I just do the words. Yeah.
People always like to think that I'm just being modest, and it's like, no, seriously.
Yeah, I can't. I'll drop it. I'm like, okay, you're
Yeah.
right. Not lying.
And I think, from the Boom perspective, what really got us excited about this project was that it wasn't just about world building. That at the heart of it, all of the stories that Trevor and Matt came to the table with were rooted in character, exploring a story that is timeless. So, and what I think actually works really well about Lantern City in terms of world building is that each of the different mediums that you guys are exploring with it take a different perspective on the world, right? So the novel is about the founder of the Grey Empire, so it's almost kind of, it's this viewpoint of somebody who eventually is on top. The TV show that you guys are developing is from the perspective of an outsider, someone like us that's coming into this world and discovering it for the first time, and that's a different perspective. And then Sander's story is that of a worker, of someone who is kind of a cog in the machine and is trying to break it.
And that's actually kind of an interesting thing, and I'm gonna sound like a bitch. But basically, the interesting thing for me coming in was that I had come in after you guys had started writing the comic book series, and I had never read Rise explicitly. And I remember our first meeting when I sort of realized what my function has to be, which is something, if you are doing world building, you're going to want to bring in people, because I sat down and I remember we spent like 4 hours walking through the entire plot, and I was just like, well, I don't know why there's no reason for this to happen. Well, it links in, if you read the novel, and if that is ever an answer to anything, no.
Right.
You know, and I remember like you were like, oh well, because in the novel, and I'm like, I didn't read the novel, I don't care, it has to work just in this story. Like it's very easy as you get into it.
I only cried a little bit, like
I know,
once.
I'm so sorry.
I promise.
I walked out of that,
like
I'm like,
one single.
It's like a
it's
good
fine.
flash.
Yeah, that's it.
I walked out, I'm like, and I'm fired. Like, I really did. I felt really bad.
No,
'Cause, like,
well,
I
actually,
don't-
before Mairghread came on, our editors at the time said, she's just very direct.
She's very direct. She'll tell you exactly what you think.
That's great. And then we didn't realize that it came.
Yeah, no, they were
Harsh.
right. Well, I mean, that's well, like Mary's like a James Bond villain, so I don't know why.
Oh my gosh.
Okay,
Good cop, bad cop, definitely.
but the important thing is that when you're in a world and you're building out a world and you see all the links, it is so easy to forget that every story has to exist on its own, and what you really do have to know. And I do that all the time with Transformers, where like I will try and give my books to people who've never read Transformers or people who don't even like Transformers. And I'm just trying to constantly check myself, because it's so easy to forget that, you know, well, but this needs to happen for this other book, but everything in that story has to exist, everything important has to exist to serve that story. You know, minor details like little throwaway lines, little things about this breed of animal, or you know, what this person likes, like those can all be great little throwaway things for world building, but any major plot action, any major character motivation has to tie into the existing story that you're writing, and it has to pace out for the existing medium that you're writing. So if you're building a world, keep constantly checking in with people and keep trying to ask yourself, you know, if I don't know anything about this, what do I actually have to know? What am I assuming people know in my world?
You know, I think that, like Mairghread certainly helped open my eyes to those things. And even as a reader, I tried to read The Secret Wars last year, and I needed to have my Marvel Encyclopedia next to me. And I don't like to have my Marvel Encyclopedia next to me when I'm reading it.
Heavy. You don't like lifting.
It is. It's a hard book too.
But I mean, like I said earlier, one of the rules, make sure that you don't have to know about something else. And I was breaking that rule even on our own property, because you just, like you said, you just don't always think about it in that way.
But then what works out well together was because I'd be like, well, you want to have that balance, because then I'm like, okay, well that doesn't actually inform this particular story, but then we can work that in, so you get the richness of it works. Because what you really want is you want every action to inform both ways, this story and future stories. You know, so it's important to just have those opposite ends of the spectrum to sort of reach that nice balance.
And also, world building is a lot more fun with more people.
Yeah.
And you need more. You need all these voices to help you. If you're just a sort of singular creator and you don't want anybody's opinion about anything, you're not going to have a successful world, because you need to see all of the different elements within that. So, and we actually have some issue 12 artwork, sort of talking about actually building this world. So this is Benjamin Carre. He's our cover illustrator, and this is just from his little simple sketch all the way to the final piece. And we got to play around since it's issue 12. We got a little bit of fun. We have a wraparound cover for issue 12 for the last issue, and then the next image is actually the sketch and final from Dave Dorman, who is our one of our great cover artists as well. And we sort of had an image that we did of the Lantern City Guard helmet, one of the incentive covers for issue 1, and then we're sort of closing it back out again in a big circle back to issue 12.
And that'll also be the cover for trade number 3.
Yeah, trade number 3. So in expanding our world, we've talked about how we started it and sort of some of the steps we took. What you see on the screen right now, these are the CG models for the upcoming Lantern City RPG game. So what we're doing with the game is, which will hopefully come out in 2017, is we're actually sort of allowing you to create your own storylines. and using.
Because I have not done a good job.
Yeah, Matt's been fired. It's exclusive. Matt's been fired. But essentially through augmented reality and an iPad app, along with some physical gameplay elements, you'll actually be able to control parts of the city as either the Grey Empire and the Lantern City Guard, or the revolution that's going on with the workers, or part of the underground uprising. So you sort of have these three factions that are going to constantly be battling, and sort of like a game of chess, it's always going to come out differently. And we'll write storylines that will help to support all of that as an extension of the world, but also allowing us to really be able to play individually. And I think the next one is actually one of the prototype images. That's the actual production model. And this is another product that we're working on right now. It's a 14-inch Lantern City maquette. That's a model kit that will be available in May. And there's a whole storyline that's around that as well. So this particular Lantern City Guard character, who then got a job as the third stormtrooper on the left.
He's very conflicted.
He's really all over the place. But
Don't ask him
he's a
to
good
keep
guy.
saying too
So we're actually also extending out in the physical world as well. Like this is the Lantern City Guard helmet, which we built and created. And on the next slide, you can see this is actually an actual lantern lamp design that we're building as well. And we have a whole story around the Grey Empire. This is J.W. Kinsey, who's a steampunk artist who's working on this for us, and that'll be available later on in the year. It's an actual desk lamp that you can get. But there's a whole sort of, I want one, I know you do. It'll be priced accordingly for you.
Excellent.
But essentially, there's a whole sort of little story about this lamp, but about the Grey Empire and one of the clerks in the library, sort of the underground library, and this lamp appears there. So it's like even in products and sort of licensing, you can find ways to expand your world and build things out. I think the last one, yeah, so also we're going to continue on, probably next year we'll continue on with comics as well in a shorter series around Lazelle, who is one of the supporting characters in the comic book series and definitely a fan favorite.
Yeah, someone cosplayed her.
That's right, somebody
awesome.
cosplayed her already, yeah.
That's when I knew I made it.
So
Drop the mic.
Yeah.
Walk
I
out.
can't.
I wrote that. It's on a mic
Take the whole
stand, you
table.
can't drop it. But essentially, all part of that, we're working on a short story, sort of a book of collected short stories. There's a cosplay book that we're working on. And just everybody that's sort of building their own worlds, I really encourage everybody to see every opportunity as something that you can enhance your storyline, you can enhance your world, you can find a way to take, a product or a licensing agreement and build a story around it. You can, the easiest thing, one of the things we did as the comic came out is that Matt wrote a really great prequel story about Sander called Devil's Corner, which is actually going to be collected in the second volume, which comes out in the summer of Lantern City. And even a simple little story that we released online informed the character, talked about Sander's, young teenage life.
And I actually think, like, if you are in the audience and you're interested in world building as a creative person or as an aspiring writer, the Lantern City website's a really great resource because you guys are constantly posting kind of behind the scenes looks at the process and what you're working on, and so it can be a real great source of inspiration for people.
Yeah. And that's lanterncitytv.com, and we also have Facebook and Twitter, and any of those really let you get all of the updates and everything else that's going on with the property. So.
Unfortunately, I think we've been told we're out of time. So, okay, one quick question. Just got a super quick one.
We'll also be down signing.
No?
We will.
Okay, so Lantern City is available at the Boom Studios booth, 1611 downstairs. These guys will be down there signing at 2 p.m.
Yeah, half an hour.
We have a Volume 1.
Volume 1 hardcover. Before you can get it in stores,
Early debut here at Wondercon.
sell it on eBay for $1 more, and then you could buy it.
Be the first kid on your block. The Lantern City Volume.
So, great.
Hey,
Thank you, everybody.
thank you so much for
coming.
joining us.
Thank you, everyone.